they were French, and a few other countries, but the main countries would be Namibia, Angola, Mozambique. And why am I leaving out Zimbabwe? Because in Zimbabwe, Ian Smith had declared UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence. And here was a white man and a white regime declaring unilateral declaration of independence in an African country. And so that was another place where the struggle was taking place, with the Africans attempting to get their liberation. And so those were the countries where liberation was taking place. So the question is, in a sense, what is this liberation that we're talking about? And in simple terms, we can say these people were struggling for their independence. They were struggling to be sovereign. And to be sovereign means they were struggling to be able to make decisions for themselves, about themselves. Because prior to that, it was the British or some elite who were making decisions for them. And independence really meant struggling to put in place a mechanism where you get rid of foreign domination, foreign control, and you're able now to put your own systems in place to make decisions for yourself. And that is what liberation in a sense meant. But liberation could not mean only that. Because you can struggle, get rid of the former rulers, but if you don't have the capacity to make and implement decisions, then you might be in the same position. So liberation has to be seen as something beyond merely getting rid of the former rulers, but having the capacity locally to be able to work for the good of your country. And so when we talk about Burnham being involved in African liberation, we have to see his involvement beyond merely assisting countries to get independence, so to speak, but him being involved in assisting them to build the capacity to administer their affairs after they would have gotten independence. And it's in that context I want to say a few things about Burnham and African liberation specifically. One of the things Burnham did for African liberation was he created a fund here in Guyana where he made a donation towards African liberation, a monetary donation. That would have gone to the frontline states, and they would have worked out how they supported the various movements in those countries which I mentioned. So that's number one. He, in Guyanese language, he places money where his mouth was. He doesn't blah blah it. You have some other people who blah blah a lot. But Burnham made the sacrifice of giving of the little that we had towards the liberation struggle in Africa. He also facilitated the freedom fighters. Those freedom fighters, because in Africa the liberation took the form of armed struggle. The colonizers were so determined not to give up that the struggle had to become armed struggle. There was no option. That's the only option they had for liberation. And he facilitated those freedom fighters because they could not move about freely. Some of them had to live overseas. They couldn't go home. They would be arrested. They would be placed in jail. And we know of two persons who suffered that. One we know of very well. That is Mandela of South Africa, that he was in prison. But we don't hear that much about Toivo Yatoivo. He is the equivalent of Mandela in Namibia. He also was imprisoned, I think, for 21 years. Toivo Yatoivo. But by the time he came out, Jomo had already become the leader of SWAPO. But Toivo Yatoivo had done as much and suffered as much and is revered as much in Namibia as Mandela is in South Africa and across the globe. So one of the things Burnham did was to facilitate movement of these people. How did he do that? No, he did it. He provided them with Guyanese passports. We couldn't say it then. We could say it now. They were issued Guyanese passports, so they could travel like a Guyanese, but they were doing liberation business. And I'm not telling you this because somebody told me. I think in 1975, it was, or no, 77, I had the privilege of meeting some of these guys in Guyana and had in my own home one James Chikarima, who was from Zimbabwe. Came to Guyana. They used to come here, meet Burnham, and he would talk with them and give them advice and so forth. And I had the privilege as a young man, not yet, don't think I was 21 years old, of having James Chikarima, one of the freedom fighters, in my home. And I could see what he traveled with. James traveled with a Guyanese passport, and so many others whose names are untold traveled with those passports. Burnham was prepared to go that far to help in African liberation, that he embraced them as brothers and sisters and gave them Guyanese citizenship, for more or less we could say, because they were exercising Guyanese rights as they traveled. I remember at this time Jane Phillips Gay, heroine of this country. And Jane, one of the things Jane used to do was to collect donations of material and money under the then Women's Revolutionary Socialist Movement. And she would collect the stuff, used to be stored in New Market Street, and when she got enough, we would send it off to Africa. Clothing and whatever else she could collect. The late Jane Phillips Gay did that, and I witnessed that as well when she was going through that process. That's another way in which we help. Whatever material assistance we could have given at the people's level, Burnham facilitated, and Jane Phillips Gay was a major person in that regard. In 76, I was in Tanzania as a student and came across a number of soldiers who had actually gone to Angola in particular. They had gone to. A number of soldiers. And when we were graduating, my college recommended that as a part of our getting to know Africa, that we go to Angola for independence. That was supposed to be a treat for us. And Burnham sent back a message and said not one guy needs to go. And so up to now I haven't seen Angola. And you know, we were kind of vexed. Oh, why does man don't want us to go to Angola, of all places? We were nearby. At one time I was actually in a region which was on the border with Angola. And it stopped us. It stopped a good, nice trip. When I came home, I recognized why he stopped us. Because prior to that independence, there were three movements in Angola. There was the FNLA, which was backed by the Americans, through Holding Roberto of Zaire, Congo. There was UNITA, which seemed to have had Chinese support, John Savimbi. And Savimbi came here too. Came here, I met him here. And there was MPLA. And the progressive world decided MPLA was a more progressive force in Angola. FNLA was operating more closer to the border of Zaire, and the support was coming across the border from there. UNITA was operating more from South African end, and there was some Chinese engagement there. And MPLA was kind of holding middle ground. And as MPLA moved towards liberating all of South Africa, there was intervention from the Angola, there was intervention from the South African side, with the South Africans themselves being involved, trying to stymie the progress of MPLA. And the Cubans had to come, another set of internationalists, and Cuban, Fidel in particular, had to pitch in to help MPLA. And so Fidel decided he would actually send troops to Angola. And if you know the geography, where Guyana is located is a straight flight across the Atlantic. Straight flight across the Atlantic. And the planes didn't have the reach to go from Cuba to Angola without refueling. And you had to find friendly territory to refuel in. And Burnham made the bold decision that those planes would come here and refuel. We couldn't say it then, we probably even denied it. But all those soldiers who went to liberate Angola passed through Guyana on their way to Angola. And so that was another significant contribution made to African liberation. If that had not happened, Angola would not have been freed. And I dare say if Angola wasn't freed, Mozambique would have had a more difficult time to be freed. Namibia, Zimbabwe, all of those countries would have had a greater difficulty because you'd have had more fronts to fight on at the same time. You'd have had a bad example, a bad inspiration. But what happened in Angola became an inspiration for the continuation of the struggle in the other countries. And so Guyana made a significant contribution. What a lot of Guyanese do not understand is that we paid a price for that. It wasn't for free. There was a lot of reaction by other forces when they found out what had happened. And all of this thing about us not having flow and all of that is not straightforward. It had to do with the role we played and the role Burnham played in African liberation. We used to get flour on a program called the PL480 program. They stopped us from getting the flour, the wheat. It was stopped. And with the other pressures and the foreign exchange problems we had, we just simply didn't have what it took to import the wheat anymore. But it was because of our contribution, because of our position in African liberation, among other things, that happened. And Guyanese need to know that. Because you have a lot of young Guyanese who walk about now and say, Burnham, the man with the hard lines. We line up for a reason. We line up for the liberation of our brothers and sisters in Africa. And we should know that we did that and be proud of it. And not decry him for the position that he took. Nothing in life is free. Everything has a price. And we were paying the price for what we believed in when we had our problems in the mid-70s on to the 80s. The forces that be were getting back at us for the position we took. And we took a number of positions. We took a position about Cuba and caused the first break of the blockade when the West Indian leaders decided that they would recognize Cuba. We paid the price for that as well. And the Cubans are so grateful they still send doctors. They don't send them just because they want to send doctors. They send doctors because it started as a part of the recognition of what we had done collectively with them for Angola and what we had done, among others, with them, they themselves, in terms of breaking the blockade that the Americans had imposed, and that still exists today against Cuba. And we need to have that kind of background and that kind of understanding of Burnham and his involvement in decolonization and national liberation struggles. It wasn't just one-off country arrangement. It was a system that he was struggling against. And wherever the system existed and wherever there were people local people who were struggling against the system, he joined forces with them. And that's why he also joined forces with Cuba, to struggle for Cuba, and with Cuba to struggle for others. So that was a very, very significant moment in terms of what he did. He placed pressure in every way possible. And one of the other ways was the question of sports. You know, sports is supposed to be something that unites people. It's supposed to be about peace and friendship. And he took the position that you can't have peace and friendship with people who are perpetuating apartheid and things like that. And so he took a very strong position on sports. He took such a strong position that he refused the English when they were coming with people who had played in South Africa. The opportunity to play in Ghana, he said, no, you can't play here. You can't be helping apartheid and playing here. We're not for that. So whether you were Guyanese or foreign, once you went to South Africa and collaborated with South Africa, then you were declared persona non grata here. And we know when the English team came down and they refused to withdraw the player who had played in South Africa, Robin Jackman, it was goodbye. Of course, that has a response. That had a response. But in sports, he did it. And my very good friend, my senior schoolmate, still suffers from what happened. James Wren Gilks. James Wren Gilks was on the verge of an Olympic gold medal. No one was beating him in the 200. He was on the verge of that medal. But because of our boycott of those Olympics, the Montreal Olympics, James could not run and did not win our first likely gold medal. I think James can't forget that yet. But that was another sacrifice. James has to see that as his contribution towards the struggle for his brothers and sisters in Africa, rather than seeing the lost opportunity. He had an opportunity to contribute to liberation of thousands and millions, as opposed to winning one medal. Possibly winning one medal. So that was a little more, I'm sure he would have won a medal. But that was another area in which Burnham took a firm stand that in sports, the little power we have, we will use it to help in the struggle for liberation in Southern Africa. Now, as I said earlier, liberation is not just about getting a new regime. It's about what happens after. And Burnham was conscious of that. And so what did he do in that regard? Do you know how many Guyanese went to Zambia to give secretarial service in Zambia? There were scores of Guyanese who Burnham allowed to go to Zambia, which was the main frontline, physically frontline state, that was being bombarded by Rhodesia at the time. And Burnham said, look, you're a frontline state, you're under pressure, you have manpower problems, and a lot of our secretaries, well-trained stenographers and so, were sent to Zambia. That's another contribution to the struggle in Southern Africa. But not only did he send people to Zambia, he brought people here. And so we had Namibians who came here to study. Whether it was agriculture, whether it was Secretary of Science, they came here and studied. And the reason for that is that when you gain independence, you need manpower to be able to carry out the work of the state. And so Burnham was seeing beyond just getting independence. He was seeing real, complete national liberation in the form of how do they have the capacity after they get independence to develop their country. And so in that regard, they were brought here to study. In the main, those who were brought were Namibians. And I had the privilege of meeting Namibians subsequently in other places who had studied in Ghana, whether they went to GSA, Ghana School of Agriculture, or GTI, they studied here. They had a little lounge in Sophia, If you go into Safari exhibition site, you go and you look to the south. I don't know if it's still there. There was a building. That's where they lived, the Namibians. And then they had some lived in Albert Street. Not too far from Lemaha Street. There were some Namibians living there, but they were all came here to be involved in acquiring skills, to go back to assist in the complete liberation of the country. Ghana also did significant work at the international level, the United Nations, in the Council for Namibia, and other fora, to press the issue of African liberation. All of our diplomats were used to lobby. All of our positions were positions of progressive voting against apartheid for liberation of African countries. And again, we felt we paid the price for that, because the response to that was the pressure that was placed upon us as we pursued our own national liberation. So they punished us because we wanted to be liberated and to do our own thing, and because we were helping others to be liberated and to do their own thing. And we paid the price for that. And it's important for Guyanese to understand that some of the suffering we went through, which was less suffering than our brothers and sisters, was suffering for a cause. It was not a bad man named Bonnie who wanted to eat flour and things like that. It was his position towards liberation. Local liberation, independence for Guyana, independence beyond just getting a flag and an anthem, independence in terms of building an economy that could be independent and not responsive to the pressures of other countries. Doing that for Guyana and doing that for other countries is what brought us into conflict, is what caused us to pay a price. Gordon was conscious we had to pay a price, but he was prepared to pay the price. And many Guyanese were prepared to pay the price. But many young people are told today not about the price we paid, but some bad thing this man did that made him want to light up for kerosene oil or flour or something else. All of that was caused by our involvement in the struggle for decolonization, national liberation across the globe, including our own country, and for African liberation in particular, because that is where the fight was at the time. Most of the other countries who were struggling for liberation had overcome. But we found that the Portuguese were probably the most resistant to independence for the colonies, and so they had to be engaged physically. And we found that the South Africans in South Africa and in Namibia were very resistant to any kind of justice and equality, because they found the exploitative apartheid system beneficial to the elite Afrikaners. And so the struggle was there, and we became engaged in that struggle. And so today, on the eve of the 94th anniversary, birth anniversary of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, we are gathered here to celebrate his life. We are gathered here to understand the contribution he made, not only to Guyana, but he made in the world to wherever people were under subjugation. And the place that it was most obvious, not because he simply liked them more than anybody else, but because the struggle was more intense there than anywhere else, was in Africa. Hence the question of Burnham and national liberation in Africa. Today we celebrate Africa's liberation. Today we celebrate Burnham's contribution to national liberation in Africa. I thank you.